People in Harlow thought I was odd for not asking questions. My ex-wife said it was my worst quality. You let people just exist around you, Kale, like you're afraid of what you'll find out. She meant it as a criticism. I took it as a reasonable way to live. So when Vareth Solon knocked on my shop door on a Tuesday in late October 3 years ago, holding a folded printout of my garage apartment listing from the county bulletin board, I looked at her for maybe 4 seconds and said the monthly rate, pointed to the side stairs, and told her the hot water heater made a sound like a cough at 2 in the morning, but it was harmless. She listened to all of it without blinking. Then she asked if I required references. I told her I required first month and last month, and that she didn't play music loud enough for me to hear it from the shop floor. And that was the whole of my requirements. She paid in cash, exact to the dollar. Both months, right there on my workbench, counted out in 2 neat stacks with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been handling transactions their whole life and found them neither interesting nor worth rushing. I gave her the key. She went up the stairs. I went back to the differential I'd had half out of a Silverado for the past hour. That was the beginning of it. I want to be precise about what I knew and when I knew it, because the version that will get told, the one that will filter back through channels I have no control over, with names and titles and implications I can barely follow, won't have any room for the plain truth of it. The plain truth is that for 3 years, Vareth Solon lived 12 feet above my head, paid rent on time, said good morning when our paths crossed, occasionally left a covered dish outside my shop door with no explanation, and never once gave me a reason to think she was anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. A quiet, self-contained woman from somewhere I didn't know, living a life she kept to herself, doing no harm. And I almost left it at that. Almost. Harlow is not a city. It's the kind of place that doesn't show up in search results unless you're looking for it. One main road, a grain elevator, a hardware store, a diner that changes ownership every 5 or 6 years and stays exactly the same. My shop sits at the north end of Dunn's Road, which is my family's road and has been since my grandfather built the first structure on it, a 2-bay garage that I expanded twice and then stopped expanding because 2 bays and a lift are all I've ever needed. The garage apartment above it was my grandmother's idea, built as a rental income supplement, and over the years I'd had maybe a dozen tenants cycle through it. Most stayed a year or less. A few months was more common. Vareth stayed 3 years. In that time I learned the following things about her, not through any deliberate inquiry, but through the ordinary accumulation of proximity. She didn't own a car, which was unusual in Harlow, where the nearest bus route was 11 miles away. She walked. She walked a great deal, always at the same unhurried pace, always the same direction in the morning and the opposite direction in the evening, as if she had a purpose that didn't require explanation. She bought groceries at the market, 2 blocks from the grain elevator, and carried them home in a single canvas bag regardless of how much she'd bought, which meant she shopped often and in small amounts. She didn't use the internet in any way I could detect. No Wi-Fi signal with her name on it ever showed up on my router list, though she had mentioned when she moved in that she had her own arrangement. I never saw her with a phone, though I assumed she had one. She received no mail, not one piece in 3 years. No packages, no letters, no catalogs. The mailbox I'd mounted on the landing railing stayed empty. She read. Physical books, always and always in a language I didn't recognize. Not any alphabet I could place. The characters were geometric, angular, with small marks above and below the primary lines that looked almost like notation. I saw them once when I brought a dripping pipe fitting up to show her why the water pressure was going to drop for a day while I replaced a section of supply line. She was sitting at the small table by the window with one of those books open in front of her, and she closed it in a single fluid motion when she heard me on the stairs. Not the furtive snap of someone hiding something, but the unhurried close of someone who keeps their private life. Private, which I respected entirely. She spoke English the way people speak a language they learned as adults. Correct, precise, occasionally missing the shorthand. She never used contractions when she was being careful, and when she relaxed slightly she used them, and I noticed the pattern. She did not pick up regional expressions. She did not say ain't or y'all, or any of the Harlow-specific verbal tics that get into everyone's speech. After a while, what she said she meant exactly as she said it. I found that restful. She was tall, 6'1", maybe, which got looked at in Harlow the way anything unusual got looked at, briefly, without particular malice, and then filed away. Her skin was a color I don't have a good word for in the way I'd normally reach for one. Gray, but warm gray, the way weathered cedar goes when it's old and dry in good sunlight. Her eyes were amber, not brown, not hazel, amber, like the specific amber of certain antique glass, with a quality of depth behind them that made you feel, on the rare occasions she looked directly at you, that something very patient was looking back. Her hair was short, close-cropped, with a copper undertone that was more obvious in bright light than in shade. She wasn't human. I knew that by the end of the first month. I want to be careful here, too. I didn't know it the way you know a fact you can point to. I knew it the way you know that an engine sound isn't right. Not a specific diagnosis. Just a settled certainty that the thing running is not running the way it was built to run, or rather, that it was built differently than you assumed. The gray-warm skin could have been a skin condition. The amber eyes could have been unusual genetics or contacts. The height was just height. The language in the books could have been any of a dozen writing systems I'd never studied. But there was the other thing, the thing I noticed and filed and never raised with her. When she sat still, really still, not the active stillness of someone waiting, but the deep stillness of someone who had forgotten they were in a body, she didn't breathe. Or rather, she breathed so slowly and so shallowly that from more than 10 feet away, in ordinary light, you couldn't see the movement. I'd come up the side stairs once to fix the coughing water heater, which had finally graduated from cough to something more like a sustained argument with itself, and I'd looked through the screen door before knocking and seen her sitting in the chair by the window, eyes open, not reading, not looking at anything in particular, just present in the room the way a standing stone is present in a field. I watched for 30 seconds before I knocked. In 30 seconds she did not move, did not blink, did not take a visible breath. I knocked. She was up, and at the door in the time it took me to lower my knuckles. I fixed the water heater. We talked about whether the cold snap was going to last. She said she found cold weather clarifying. I said I found it expensive, in terms of heating bills. She smiled at that, a small controlled smile, the kind that reaches the eyes without moving much else, and said that was a fair distinction, cost versus experience. Then she thanked me and I went back downstairs. I never said anything about what I'd seen through the screen door. Year one, she mostly kept to herself. I did not find this odd. I had known plenty of tenants who kept to themselves, and they were, on balance, easier to have than the ones who didn't. She was quiet in the apartment, which was the main thing. The floor between us was original construction, which meant it passed sound readily, and I knew from years of tenants exactly what the acoustic profile of the space above me communicated. Footsteps at predictable times, the particular percussion of the kitchen faucet, the muffled sound of someone moving a chair. All of that was ordinary. What was not there was what I'd had with other tenants. The television noise, the phone calls conducted at volume, the footstep pattern of someone who was restless or unhappy and pacing it out at 2 in the morning. Her footsteps were even. Her hours were consistent. She was in the apartment when she said she'd be in the apartment, and out of it when the pattern of her days said she'd be out. There was a steadiness to the life she conducted above my head that I found, without particularly analyzing it, restful. The first time I noticed something that didn't add up was in the late spring of that first year. I was working in the driveway on a Saturday, doing a brake job on my own truck, when she came back from her morning walk. She stopped at the edge of the driveway, as she sometimes did, and asked if the weather was going to hold. We talked about the weather for a few minutes. When she turned to go back up the stairs, she caught the edge of the landing post. Not hard, just a glancing contact, the kind of thing that raises an immediate bruise on a person's forearm. She looked at where the contact had been, and then she went inside, and I went back to the brake job. I saw her 2 days later, and her arm was fine. Not healing, fine. As if the contact had not happened, I filed that. Year 2, she started saying more than good morning. Not much more. But sometimes, if I was working outside, and she came back from her walk and the evening was good, she'd stop at the edge of the driveway, and we'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes about nothing consequential. The weather. The Harlow gossip that filtered through the diner. The state of the road past the grain elevator, which had been in steady decline since the county decided resurfacing it was someone else's budget problem. She had opinions about road maintenance that were, I thought, surprisingly informed. She knew about base layers and drainage grades, and the long-term cost trade-offs of deferred infrastructure spending. I asked her once what she'd done before, Harlow, just casually, the way you ask without really expecting a full answer. She said she had been in administration. I said that covered a lot of ground. She said yes, it does. We left it there. But the conversations grew. Not all at once. and not into anything that would look remarkable from the outside. She was not the kind of person who opened up in ways you could watch happening. It was more like the change in temperature in a room where someone has been sitting for a while. Gradual, ambient, until one day you notice the air is different and you can't point to the moment it shifted. By year two's winter, she would sometimes knock on the shop door and ask if I wanted coffee, and I'd come up and sit at the table by the window, and she'd set 2 cups down, and we'd sit for half an hour and talk about things neither of us had anyone else to talk to about. She asked me once about my ex-wife, not nosily. She'd seen a photograph on the workbench that I'd never gotten around to moving. The two of us at a county fair maybe 15 years back, before the marriage had started its long, slow decline into something we both endured out of habit, and then one day decided not to. I told her the short version. She listened without filling in the spaces I left, which was something I appreciated. When I finished, she said that she had understood, for most of her life, that the role she occupied made genuine closeness difficult. People were either too careful with her or expected too much. She said she had found both exhausting in their different ways. I didn't press on what role she meant. I said I could see how that would wear on a person. She said quietly that it had. We drank our coffee and watched the winter field behind the shop go dark, and that was that. But I remembered it. It was the first thing she'd said that had any weight of actual confession in it, and I held it carefully, the way you hold a thing that's been given to you without ceremony. Year 3 was the year I stopped pretending I didn't notice the other things. Not to her. I still didn't raise any of it with her. But to myself. I let myself look at the whole picture. She had been here 3 years. No visitors ever. No contact from outside. No outgoing contact that I could observe. She paid cash. She had no visible documentation that I'd ever seen her produce. She ate less than any person I'd known. I'd see her grocery bag, light enough that she swung it as she walked, and I knew roughly what a person's food needs looked like, and she was well under them. Her clothing never wore out, not in 3 years. The coat she'd arrived in, a dark charcoal thing with a collar that closed high, looked exactly as it had the day she moved in. No facing, no pilling, nowhere at the cuffs. She was hiding. I didn't know from what. I didn't ask. What I knew was that she paid her rent and did no harm, and that whatever she was hiding from had not found her here, in Harlow, at the top of my side stairs, and that as long as that held, it was not my business. The morning it stopped holding was a Wednesday in early November. I remember the light. November light in Harlow has a particular quality, flat and white and honest, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's being examined. I'd been in the shop since 6, working through a backlog that always built up after the summer tires to winter tires rush. I had a radio on low. I was under the front end of a pickup, and I'd just found that what the owner had described as a suspension noise was actually a failing ball joint. That was about 2 turns from becoming a catastrophic event, and I was writing up the additional work order in my head when I heard it. The sound was not a sound you hear in Harlow. It was not a sound you hear anywhere, actually. It was below the range where you'd call it a sound at all. It was more the physical fact of pressure, a bass resonance that you felt in your sternum before your ears registered it, the way a very large organ pipe in a cathedral makes the floor hum before the note resolves. Then it resolved, and it was enormous, and it was directly overhead. I came out from under the truck. Through the shop's single north-facing window, above the tree line, there was a ship. I have no better word than ship. It was not like the photographs I'd seen of things that governments acknowledge, the flat disc shapes, or the blurred triangles, or the lights in formation that get filmed on phones and argued about. This was a purposeful structure. Dark, not black. Dark the way deep water is dark, like the surface of something absorbing light rather than simply not reflecting it. It had weight. You could feel the weight of it even from the ground, the way you feel a loaded semi coming down a grade before you see it. It was not hovering so much as it was positioned, the way a tool is positioned before use. I looked at it for maybe 5 seconds. Then I walked to the base of the side stairs and called up. Verith. She appeared at the landing rail in under 3 seconds. She had been awake. She had been awake and she had been waiting for something, because she was already dressed in the charcoal coat, already standing with the particular stillness that I associated with her highest level of attention. She looked at me, then up at the then back at me. How long, she said. Just now, I said. I heard it first. She nodded. They will send someone to the ground within an hour, she said. They are required to give a recovery notice. Recovery notice, I said. A formal demand, she said. They will present it, and I will be given one opportunity to surrender. If I do not, They are authorized to proceed differently. I looked at the ship again. I said, how many are on that thing? She said, a standard recovery deployment is 6. The vessel carries 12 and a commander. The commander will not come to the ground. I said, what happens if they proceed differently? She said, I do not know exactly. I have been running for some time. I know what the orders were when they were first issued. Those orders were issued by someone who wanted me gone. I do not know whether the mandate has been updated. I do not know whether the intent is capture or something simpler. She said this the way you'd tell someone the weather forecast. Not flat. Exactly. There was something in it. A fine-drawn tension that I could read in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her hands on the railing. But she wasn't panicking. She was assessing. How long have you been running? I said. She looked at me then. A direct look, amber eyes level. She said, 7 of your years. I let that settle. I said, all right, come down from there. You don't want to be on an open landing when they send their 6. She came down. I held the shop door, and she walked in, and I closed it behind her and locked it. Not because it would stop anyone who came from that ship, but because locked doors are a signal, and signals matter. I walked to the workbench and moved the truck's work order paperwork to one side and leaned on it and thought for a moment. What do you need? I said. She looked at me. I mean, she really looked at me, in a way she hadn't quite done in 3 years, as if she were recalculating something. Most people, she said carefully, in this situation, ask first who I am. I know who you are, I said. You're my tenant. What do you need? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need time. 30 minutes. For what? To decide, she said, whether to run again. I straightened up from the workbench. Outside, the flat November light was unchanged. The shop was warm. It smelled like motor oil and metal, and the faint sweetness of the degreasing solvent I'd been using on the ball joint assembly. All very ordinary. All completely normal, except for the ship above the tree line that was the size of a municipal building. All right, take your time. She sat on the stool I keep at the end of the workbench for customers who want to talk while I work. She sat on it very straight, the way she sat on everything, and she put her hands flat on her knees, and she looked at the middle distance, and she thought. I went back under the truck. A failing ball joint is a failing ball joint regardless of what is happening overhead. The truck's owner drove 2 kids to school in it every morning and was going to drive it off a curve if I left it as it was. So I worked, and I let her think. And the ship held position above Harlow, and the November light stayed flat and honest through the window. 22 minutes later, she said, tell me something. I said, all right. She said, in 3 years you noticed. I know you noticed. You are not a man who misses things, Cale. I said, no. She said, you never asked. No. I said, why? I came out from under the truck and sat up on the creeper and thought about how to answer that in a way that was true and also useful to whatever she was trying to work out. I said, because you paid your rent and you kept to yourself and you weren't hurting anybody. And because whatever you were keeping to yourself, it was yours to keep. You'd tell me if I needed to know. She was quiet. You never told me. I said, which means you decided I didn't need to know. I respected that, she said. And now there's a ship the size of a warehouse sitting over Harlow, I said. And 6 people are going to come down here inside the hour and hand you a piece of paper. So now I think I need to know a little more, if that's all right. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, my full name is Vareth Solon of the House of Renvar, regnant empress of the Solvari Collective, 6th throne, by right of succession from the Renvar line. She said it flatly, the way you'd read a formal document. The throne was taken from me 7 years ago by a faction within the Succession Council. I was advised that my survival required leaving known space. I have been in what your people call the rural interior of North America for the past 3 years. I said Harlow. She said Harlow. I turned that over for a moment. Then I said, the administration background. Something shifted in her face. A very slight thing, almost imperceptible, a slight softening around the eyes, which on her I had come to understand was the equivalent of a broader expression on most people. She said, yes. Okay, I said. I stood up, brushed the grit off my knees out of habit, and looked at the window. The ship was still there. What happens if you run? Do you have somewhere to go? She said. I have always had somewhere to go. That is how I have survived. But each move makes the next one harder. I am running out of places where I am not yet known. And if you don't run, she said, then I stand, and I either surrender, or I assert my standing. The recovery team is bound by collective law. If I formally assert my standing as regnant empress and decline surrender, they cannot proceed under a recovery mandate. They would be required to return and report. The mandate would require escalation through the Succession Council, which is a longer process, and one that has more room for challenge. So why have you been running for 7 years instead of doing that? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because asserting my standing requires a witness of neutral standing who can confirm the assertion was made freely and without coercion. A Salvari witness would be considered partial. An independent witness, a non-collective presence, carries the standing of a first-party account, under collective protocol. I said, you need a human. She said, yes. I said, you've been in Harlow for 3 years. She said quietly, yes. I looked at her. She held the look steadily. There was something in her expression that I could only call careful, not calculated, not strategic, careful. The expression of someone who has carried a weight for a very long time and has learned not to put it down because the putting down was not offered and asking for it was not something she permitted herself. She had not asked. In 3 years, she had not once asked. I said, why didn't you tell me? She said, because it would have placed you in a position of obligation towards someone you did not choose to be obligated to, and because she started again. You were the first person in 7 years who treated me as a person and not as either a problem or an asset. I did not want to change what that was. I stood with that for a little while. The ship outside held position. In the tree line above the shop, I could see the light from it, a steady underpulse of blue-white, the rhythm of something running at idle. I said, all right, here's what we're going to do. She looked at me. When they come, I said, I'll answer the door. I'll take the notice. And then we'll both be here when you make your assertion. You tell me the words I need to say. I'll say them correctly. She said very quietly, Kale. I said, you've been running for 7 years. I don't think you should run anymore. She looked at me for a long moment. The amber eyes were steady. Something moved through them that I didn't have a name for. Not relief exactly, not surprise exactly. Something older and quieter than either of those things. She said, you understand what this means. To stand with me in this. I said, I understand that 6 people are going to knock on my shop door, and I'm going to have to decide whether to send them away or deal with them. I'd rather deal with them. It is not a small thing, she said. No, I said, but it's the right thing. I've known that since about the end of year 1. She was very still. Then she said, you said you knew who I was. Your tenant, I said. That's still true. She stood up from the stool. She drew herself up, not that she needed to. She was already tall, but there was a change in how she occupied the space. The stillness I associated with her deepest attention shifted into something else. Something that had less to do with waiting and more to do with weight. Not the weight of the ship above us, not the weight of 7 years of running. A different weight. Older. The weight of someone remembering that they have a shape they've been standing in all their life and have simply not been standing in it visibly, she said. Then you should know one more thing before they come. She said it carefully. In Salvari protocol, a neutral witness who confirms a standing assertion under contested succession law becomes formally recognized in the record of that assertion. Permanently, the record cannot be altered. It will exist in collective archives regardless of the outcome. I said, what does that mean practically? She said, it means that whatever happens, whether I succeed or fail, your name will be in the account. A human name in a collective record as the witness who stood with the last true empress of the Renvar line. I looked at the rack of socket sets on the wall, for no particular reason. Then I looked back at her. Kale done, I said. 2 L's, 1 N. Her face did the thing that on her I had come to understand was a smile, deeper than the surface, most of the motion happening in the eyes. She said, I know how to spell your name. We waited. She coached me on the exact phrasing I'd need. She said it twice, had me repeat it back twice, corrected 1 word in my second pass, and said the first version was acceptable, but the second was better. I said the better version 3 more times until it sat comfortably in my mouth. She listened each time with the focused attention of someone who understood that the words mattered, and that getting them right was not ceremony but law. When we'd finished the rehearsal, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, I want to tell you something, before they come. Not because it is relevant to what will happen today, but because you are owed it. I said, all right. She said, the covered dishes. I know you were curious. Salvari formal custom does include a provision of food as acknowledgement of shelter given to a member of the regnant line. That is true. But I want you to know that I did not choose to do it because of the custom. I chose to do it because it was the only thing I could think of that. She paused, choosing words with her usual care. That expressed what I wanted to express, without requiring you to do anything in return. Food is something a person needs. I was paying the same debt your grandfather's building let me pay every month, but in a different currency. She looked at the workbench. You eat simply, she said. I noticed that. I tried to make things that would be good without being strange. I do not always know exactly how things will translate, but I thought about it, each time. I want you to know I thought about it, I said. I know you did. They were always good. She looked at me, then she said simply, I am glad. The 6 came 47 minutes after the ship appeared. I heard the sound of their approach before I saw them, not footsteps, but the faint harmonic signature of whatever they used for personal transport, a cycling whine that rose to a tone just above hearing range and then stopped. I was at the workbench pretending to work. Verith was standing at the back of the shop, in the shadow of the second bay, very still, waiting. They knocked on the shop door. Not a human knock. 3 strikes with a flat impact that sounded like someone hitting the metal door with a piece of pipe, perfectly spaced, no variation. I went to the door and opened it. They were not what I'd pictured, which was probably foolish of me to have pictured anything. They were tall, not as tall as Verith, most of them, but tall. Their armor was a deep bronze, not shining, with close-fitting segments that moved smoothly when they moved. Their faces were visible. They wore no helmets, and they were in the family of humanoid but outside the range I'd put as human. 2 of them had a bone ridge above the brow that ran from temple to temple. Their eyes were dark, very dark and very still. The one in front held a flat object, a display panel of some kind, dark gray, the size of a clipboard. He held it the way a bailiff holds a document at a hearing. He said something I didn't understand. The language was structured, very structured, with what sounded like case endings and tonal markers, and it moved faster than I expected. I said, I don't speak that, English. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, in English that was flatter and more precise than Verith's, accented differently, we are executing a recovery mandate for the fugitive individual known as Verith Solon, wanted under Succession Council Decree 7 Renvar, in the matter of contested succession in the Solvari Collective. We are required to deliver formal notice and to allow 1 period of voluntary compliance. Is the individual present at this location? I said. She is. He held out the display panel. I took it. It was heavier than it looked, warm on the back where it had been in his hand. I said, I'm Cale Dunn. I own this property. I'll witness this transaction. I said the words exactly as she'd coached me, in the order she'd given them. I am a citizen of a non-collective sovereign, witnessing under the protocols of neutral standing. Do you acknowledge my standing? The 6 of them were still for a moment. The leader looked at me with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite calculation, something between. Then he said, neutral standing acknowledged, Cale Dunn of Earth. Your presence is registered. Behind me, Verith walked forward from the shadows of the second bay. I don't know if I can describe what that was like to watch. I've been trying to find the words for it since it happened, and I keep coming up against the limit of what language can do with something that is primarily physical. When she moved out of the shadow and into the flat November light coming through the shop's north window, it wasn't that she looked different. She looked exactly the same coat, same height, same close-cropped copper-tinted hair, same amber eyes. But the space around her changed. The way the space in a room changes when someone who has been holding themselves quiet suddenly stops holding. She was not Verith from the garage apartment. She was not my tenant of 3 years, the woman who brought me covered dishes and read geometric books, and spoke English with careful precision, and walked to the market in a canvas bag. She was all of those things, and she was also something else, something that had been in the room all along but that I had only seen in brief flashes. In the 30-second stillness through the screen door, in the full-stop quality of her attention when she chose to give it. She was all of it at once, and the sum of it was extraordinary. The 6 hunters went still. Not all at once, but in sequence, like a wave moving through them. First the leader, then the 2 on his left, then the 3 on the right. A stillness that started at the front and propagated back, and by the end of it none of them were moving at all. Verith stood at my right shoulder. She said, in English, I think for my benefit so I could follow. I am Verith Solon of the House of Renvar, 6th throne, regnant empress by right of succession. I decline the recovery mandate. I assert my standing under Article 12 of Collective Succession Protocol, which prohibits the forcible removal of a confirmed regnant lineholder from voluntary exile, absent a ruling of the full Succession Council, not a faction thereof. She paused. I invoke that protection here now, before a registered neutral witness. She looked at me. Will the witness confirm the assertion was made freely and without coercion? I said. I confirm it. She looked back at the 6 hunters. Neutral standing confirmed, she said. The assertion is in the record. The leader of the 6 stood very still. He was looking at Vareth the way you look at something. When the category you'd put it in is no longer the right category, and you are recalibrating without being sure of the new one. He said something in Solvari, a sentence, 3 or 4 words, and I didn't understand the words, but I understood the register. It was a formal register, not a question and not a statement. Something in between, something procedural. Vareth said, in English, he is invoking the identity confirmation protocol. He needs to verify that I am who I claim to be. He will use a scan. You don't need to do. The leader reached to his belt, very slowly, the kind of slow you do when you want the human watching to understand that the reach is controlled, and removed a device smaller than my palm, flat and dark. He held it toward Vareth. It emitted a sound, a single tone, not quite a beep rounder than that, with a small ring of blue light that traveled over the device's surface and stopped. Then there was a silence. The leader looked at the device. Then he looked up at Vareth. Then he looked back at the device. And then he did something I wasn't expecting, which was to take a single step back. He said something in Solvari. Vareth said, very quietly, he says the line is confirmed. The leader said one more thing. Then, with the careful movement of someone following a procedure they know by rote, he went to one knee. The 2 on his left went to one knee. The 3 on his right went to one knee. All 6 of them, on the asphalt of my shop driveway, in the flat November light of Harlow, heads bent slightly forward. Vareth stood and received this without moving. I stood next to her and watched it and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. After a moment she said, still in English, he is asking what my orders are. I looked at the 6 kneeling hunters and said, what are your orders? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to think about that. All right, I said. She turned to the leader and said something in Solvari. Formally, clearly, with the cadence of a declaration. He responded with a single word. She nodded. She said to me, I've told him the mandate is suspended pending formal succession council review. He will return to the ship and report. The ship will hold position until the review process is initiated. How long does that take? Some time, she said. Not immediately, but it will not be long now. The 6 hunters rose. The leader looked at Vareth one last time, and then at me, and the look he gave me was respectful in the way a professional respects an outcome that surprised them. Not warm, not unfriendly, simply level. He inclined his head, not deeply, not a bow, just a degree or 2 of acknowledgement. Then they withdrew, back through the tree line, and I heard the cycling harmonic of their departure, and then nothing. Vareth and I stood in the driveway for a moment. The ship was still up there. It would be for a while, she said, until the review process was formally logged. But it wasn't doing anything. It was just there, in the flat November sky, the blue-white underpulse steady and slow. I said, you want some coffee? She looked at me. I said, I've got a pot on. It's probably been sitting too long, but it's hot, she said after a moment. Yes, thank you. We went inside. I filled 2 mugs from the machine on the workbench shelf. She held hers in both hands, the way she always held a warm cup when I'd given her one in the past. Both hands, thumbs facing up, like someone who'd been cold for a long time, and found the warmth worth attention. I leaned on the workbench, and we stood there in the warm shop and didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, what happens now? She said, the recovery mandate goes to the full council. The faction that issued it will have to defend it. The Renvar line confirmation will be in the official record. It becomes very difficult to proceed against a confirmed regnant with a neutral witness, standing in the record. But not impossible, I said. Not impossible, she said. Politics are not impossible anywhere, but it is significantly harder. They will need a council majority, not just a faction. And they will need to answer the question of why a regnant empress of confirmed succession spent 7 years in exile in a sovereign non-member world. I said, is the answer to that question good for you or bad for you? She said, it is very good for me. I drank my coffee. Outside, the ship's underpulse was a faint light in the window. I said, when they come back, what happens to you? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I go back, to the throne. Yes, she said, and then with a care I could feel in it, to a throne that will be very different from the one I left, because I have been here, and because of what I have been here. You cannot govern from a throne the same way if you have spent 3 years paying rent in cash and walking to a market in a canvas bag. I said, is that good? She looked at me with the amber eyes and said, I believe so. The ship held position above Harlow for 9 days. People noticed it. Of course they did. Harlow is not the kind of place that has ships above it, and the first day brought traffic on Dunn's Road that I hadn't seen since the one time a film crew came through to use the grain elevator as a backdrop. County officials came, state officials called. There was federal involvement of some kind, though what exactly that involved I was never fully told. I told the officials what I knew, which was the truth, as cleanly as I could tell it. My tenant had a legal matter with people from a government I didn't have jurisdiction over. The matter was being handled through their own legal process. She'd asked me to stand as a witness, and I'd done it. I referred them to Vareth for anything beyond that. Vareth received them. That's the right word for it. Received them. In the shop, at the workbench, standing with her hands at her sides and the amber eyes level, and she was patient and specific, and gave them exactly as much information as they needed to understand the situation without giving them any foothold to complicate it. She was, I realized, watching her, very good at this. Not polished in the political way I'd seen on screens, the managed performance of it. Good in the way a person is good at a thing they were built for, the way I'm good with an engine. Not because I perform it, but because I understand it from the inside. By day 5, the federal presence had settled into a kind of watchful non-interference. Someone had made a decision at a level I had no visibility into, and the decision was apparently, let it proceed. Those 9 days were strange. Not bad strange, just a kind of altered ordinary, the way time moves differently when something big is pending and you're inside it. Vareth stayed in the apartment, but spent more time in the shop than she ever had. Not because she needed anything from it, but because I think she found the work of it calming. The same reason I find it calming. There is nothing uncertain about a machine. It either works or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, the reason is findable if you're patient and methodical. She would sit on the customer stool and watch me work, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and the days passed with the particular quality of time that while you're in it, you will remember. On day 4, she asked if she could hand me tools. I said that was fine, and showed her the basic organization of the socket set and the placement of the wrenches by size. She learned it in one pass. After that, she'd watch where I was working and anticipate what I'd reach for next, and she was right more often than not. She didn't say much while she was doing it. She just paid attention, which is the main thing. On day 6, she asked me what I thought she should do differently when she returned. She asked it in the careful way she asked things she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. I said I didn't know anything about running a government. She said, "You know about people, what they need from the person who holds authority over them." I thought about it. I said, "They need to know you've stood somewhere they've stood. Not the same place. You don't have to have lived their life, but somewhere things were hard, and you didn't have anyone to handle it for you. So when something goes wrong in their life, you don't just see it from a height." I paused. "You've had 7 years of that. That's worth something." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Yes, I believe it is." She also asked, on day 7, about the truck with the ball joint, whether I'd finished it, whether the owner had gotten it back safely. I told her the owner had picked it up on day 2, that the kids were being driven to school in it again, that the owner had been appropriately alarmed when I explained what another week of driving it would have meant. She nodded at that with what I recognized as genuine satisfaction. Not performed interest. She actually wanted to know that the children were safe. I thought about that in the days after she left. An empress of a galactic collective, sitting on a shop stool, wanting to know that 2 kids in a small town in the middle of an American continent were getting to school without incident. That seemed like the right thing for a person in her position to care about. I hoped she carried it with her. On the 8th day, a second ship appeared. This one was different in scale and character. Larger, much larger, with a different quality of presence. Where the first ship had the air of a tool positioned for use, this one had the air of a structure. A mobile structure, but a structure. It arrived at dawn and held position above the first one, and the blue-white pulse of the first ship's systems shifted in frequency. Just slightly, in a way that I can't explain technically, but that felt like a chain in the room, feels when someone walks in who has authority in it. Vareth watched the second ship from the landing rail and said nothing for a long time. I came up the stairs and stood with her, and we watched it together. She said, "That is the Succession Council's formal observation vessel. They sent it." I said, "Is that good?" She said, "It means the matter is being taken seriously at the highest level." "Yes, it is good." I said, "How much longer?" She said, "1 more day." She was right. On the 9th day, just after noon, the cycling harmonic came down again, and this time it was not 6, it was 20, in 2 ranked columns, in armor that was not bronze but gold, a different unit, a different standing. In the center of the formation was an individual who was not armored at all, who wore a long coat of a deep blue-black with a chain of office across it that caught the November light and held it in a way that was not metal, not quite. This person walked to the front of my shop with the measured pace of someone who has been practicing measured paces all their life, and stopped, and looked at Vareth, who had come down from the landing and was standing in the driveway, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the individual in the blue-black coat said something in Solvari, and it was formal and long, and I understood none of it. But I understood what happened next, which was that all 20 of the armored figures in the columns behind the individual went to one knee. Then the individual in the blue-black coat went to one knee, and then they said, in English, clearly, with a formality that turned each word into a weight, "Welcome home, Empress." Vareth stood and received this in silence. Then she said, in English, still for me, I knew, still so I could follow, I accept the council's formal recognition. I will return to the seat on the condition that the record of my exile stands intact, including the record of my years of residence in this location and the name of the neutral witness who stood with me. She looked at me, intact permanently. The figure in blue-black bowed their head. The condition is accepted. Vareth turned to me. We'd said most of what there was to say in the 9 days. We'd said things over coffee and over the workbench and standing in the driveway in the November cold, and I knew that there wasn't going to be a conversation that covered everything, and I'd made peace with that. I said, the apartment's going to be empty. She said, I know, and then I am sorry. Don't be, I said. You stayed 3 years. That's longer than most of them. She looked at me with the amber eyes. She was very still, and then she said very quietly, you treated me like a person, Kale. For 3 years, no obligations, no performance required. You asked for nothing and offered the ordinary decencies without keeping count of them. I want you to know that in 7 years of running, I did not encounter that anywhere else. I said, you're going to encounter it other places, she said. I hope so. I intend to ensure it. I believed her. She stepped forward and put her hand out, right hand, palm slightly up, the way she'd extended it every month for 3 years when she brought down the rent. I took it. Her grip was steady. Warmer than I expected, somehow, warmer than the gray warm of her skin in ordinary light. She held the grip for a moment and then released it. She turned and walked to the front of the formation, and the formation closed behind her, and they moved back toward the tree line and the ships above. I watched until the last of the gold-armored figures cleared the tree line. Then I went back inside, washed my hands at the shop sink, and went back to the ball joint on the pickup. The kid's father had been waiting for it for 2 days, and I was already behind, and there was no point in being further behind. Above the shop, through the north window, I watched the ships rise. First the recovery ship, then the observation vessel, then both of them together, climbing without any visible effort through the flat November sky of Harlow until they were above the cloud layer and then gone. The sky was the same sky it had always been. The apartment was empty. I'd have to rent it again, which was fine. There was always someone needing a place. I finished the ball joint. I wrote up the work order. I swept the shop floor, which I do every evening regardless of how the day went, because a clean floor is a safe floor, and a safe floor is a floor where I don't twist an ankle finding something in the dark. I made coffee. I poured it. I stood at the window and drank it and watched the dark sky above Harlow. Somewhere up there, in a ship the size of a municipal building, Vareth Solon of the House of Renvar, regnant empress of the Solvari Collective, 6th throne, by right of succession, was going home. She'd left the last covered dish on my workbench before she came down for that final morning. Same as always, covered with a folded cloth, no note, no explanation. I hadn't opened it yet. I was going to eat it for dinner, sitting at the workbench the way I sometimes did when the evenings were quiet. I thought about what she'd said. You treated me like a person, Kale. I thought about the 30 seconds through the screen door, watching her sit in perfect stillness and not saying anything when she opened the door. I thought about the geometric books and the cash rent and the canvas grocery bag and the 1,100 small ordinary Tuesday mornings of 3 years. I thought about the coffee at the table by the window in year 2's winter, and the things she'd said about people being either too careful with her or expecting too much, and how she'd found both exhausting in their different ways. I thought about her face, in the flat November light of the shop, when she stepped forward out of the shadow of the second bay, and all 6 of the hunters went still. You cannot govern from a throne the same way, she'd said. If you've spent 3 years paying rent in cash and walking to a market in a canvas bag, I hope that was true. I believed it was true. I thought the Solvari Collective, whatever it was going to become, was probably going to be governed by someone who understood what it felt like to be cold and quiet and far from home, and to have a neighbor who didn't ask questions about things that were not their business. That seemed like a reasonable thing to put at the head of a government. Better than most of the alternatives I could think of. I washed the mug. I turned off the shop light. I went upstairs to my own rooms, not the garage apartment, and I stood at the window for a while, and the sky was dark and cloudless and very full of stars, and I thought, she's up there somewhere in all of that. I did not feel small, looking at it. I felt like Cale Dunn, who owned a shop on Dunn's Road in Harlow, and who had rented his garage apartment to a woman who needed a place to be ordinary for a while, and who had said the right things when the right things were needed, and who had his name in a record that would outlast anything he'd ever put his hands on. I turned off the light. I went to bed. In the morning, I'd put the apartment back on the bulletin board. First month and last. Cash preferred. No music loud enough to hear through the floor. The sky was full of stars. I slept fine.